morning to introduce our speaker, Dr. Dame Tessa Blackstone. She is an academic, an educationalist, and a politician. From 1987 to 1997, she was Master of Birkbeck College of London University. And after that, she served as a Minister of State in the Labour government, first in the Department of Education and Employment, and then as a Minister of State for the Arts. She was awarded a peerage in 1987. In recognition of her work as a high-achieving woman, there are two portraits of her in the National Portrait Gallery. The first is a beautiful conventional portrait painted by Annabel Cullen. The second is an amazing photo montage created in 1996 by Derry Moore, in which Tessa is in the company of 8 other distinguished women dressed as the 9 muses, elegantly seated under a golden statue of the god Apollo. The title is Modern Muses of Great Britain. It is really worth seeing. Today, however, Tessa Blackstone is going to talk about a high-achieving woman from the past. A woman, her name is Millicent Garrett Fawcett. She made a significant contribution to the fight for getting votes for women, and she was the leader of the constitutional women's suffrage movement for 50 years. So she started very young. I don't know whether Millicent Garrett Fawcett's picture is in the National Portrait Gallery, but she was the first woman to have her statue put up in Parliament Square. You can go and see it. I think it's somewhere behind Winston Churchill. I haven't actually seen it. Have you all seen it? Is it behind Winston Churchill?
It's right at the back. But that's, I think, where it was placed. That's a good space. And she is the first woman who's been honoured in that way. A bit belated, but nevertheless good news.
So Dame Tessa, welcome to Islington iu3a. We're looking forward to your talk.
Yeah, good. Thank you so much for inviting me. I should say that as a former Master of Birkbeck, I'm absolutely passionate. Sorry?
Is it on?
I'll use this.
Yeah.
This might be better.
So, would you rather have the personal mic? What can help you with the personal mic?
No, it's okay. Right. Is that okay now? Yeah. Good. Thank you very much. Let me begin by saying, as a former Master of Birkbeck, how delighted I am to be here, as I'm a passionate devotee of lifelong learning. And we should all go on learning right until the day we die. I think my motto is you've got to learn something new every day if you possibly can. And everybody here obviously believes in that too. What I'm going to do is talk for maybe up to half an hour about Millicent, and then have plenty of time for questions, comments, discussion, so that it's interactive, not me just standing at the front. I should just very briefly tell you how it came that I decided to write a book about Millicent. When I became the Master of Birkbeck, I had no idea that the Tide Cottage went with the job. And that Tide Cottage was number 2 Gower Street. When I went round to look at it, I was absolutely amazed and delighted to see that there was a blue plaque saying Millicent Garrett Fawcett lived here. And she lived there for 45 years. I lived there for 10 years. So as I walked around the rooms that she would have walked around, I thought it would be a good idea to write a book about her. And I started sort of investigating a bit more about her life. I then found that somebody was halfway through writing a book about her, so it didn't make a lot of sense to try to do a book at the same time. Moreover, I really didn't have time. I was running a college that needed a lot of work on it, and I became a life peer at the same time, so I had to get to know how to work and operate in house boards. So it wasn't actually until 2018, when the statue went up, that I thought again. It's a long time since that first book was published. and it didn't do terribly well. It's a very academic book, about 50 footnotes in each chapter. I've done it in a completely different way. I've tried to make it accessible, easy to read, no footnotes at all. So if any of you are tempted to buy it, and I hope some of you will, and of course I'll sign any copies that people do buy this morning. My hope and aim is that it will be read by large numbers of people who don't know much about her. Everybody knows about Emily Pankhurst. Not enough people know about Millicent Carey Fawcett. I'll start talking a bit about her background and her family life, because that in itself sets the theme and is very interesting. And then I'll talk a bit about the other things she did besides fighting the suffragist cause, and I'll end up with those. So let me tell you a bit about her origins. She grew up in Aldra, on the east coast in Suffolk. Her father had started life in London, although he was a Suffolk man, born and bred, but he went to London because he was the younger son, and therefore he inherited his
Speak into the mic.
Sorry?
Speak into the mic, please.
A bit closer.
Sorry. Is that right now?
Yes, thank
you. So he started off as a pawnbroker in the East End of London, but then managed to get back to Suffolk when he made it with money in London, and he married a woman who also came from a Suffolk family. He went back with two little girls and settled in Suffolk as an entrepreneur who became a maltster. He set up Snake Maltings, which some of you will be familiar with if you ever go to the opera in Suffolk. And he became a very active member of the town's organisation. He campaigned for water supplies, electricity. He was a good citizen. He started life on the right of the political spectrum, but moved in the other direction to what happens with many people. He moved left and he became liberal. He had, with his wonderful wife, 11 children, one of whom died in infancy or as a baby, and all the others survived. 6 of them were girls and 4 of them were sons. With one exception, the sons weren't terribly interesting, but many of the daughters were. All but one of them really were interesting in their own ways. Millicent was number 7, so she had 6 older siblings, one of whom, Elizabeth, became the first woman doctor, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, and had an enormous fight in order to get herself trained. The opposition from the medical profession to having a woman amongst them was huge, and she had to get help from the Society of Apothecaries. She got some of her training in Paris, where they were a little bit more liberal, but she won through in the end, and of course established the first hospital for women and children at that time in London, which became eventually the Elizabeth Garrett Anderson Hospital. And she was a feminist, and she was very influential as a role model for Millicent and her other younger sisters. The older sister married young and died young of appendicitis with 4 little tiny children. But she herself was already involved in the feminist movement and was a secretary of one of the campaign groups to try to enfranchise women. But sadly, we don't know what she might have become because she died when she was around 30. The other sister of note was Agnes, who was one who was just immediately older than Millicent, and she, with her cousin Rhoda, became the first professional interior designers who were women. And they decided they wanted initially to be architects. That was completely impossible. There were no women architects in the profession already for it, but became the apprentices to an architect who also did a lot of interior design and set themselves up as interior designers. So of the men, one was a black sheep who was sent to Australia after the army. Two of them were basically their father's helpmates in his various business enterprises. He did a lot of building, as well as the other things that I mentioned. But what was interesting about him was that he was quite politically aware, quite well read, would read the newspapers and discuss what was in the papers with his children. And his daughters were involved in all these discussions. They were not just for the sons who were sent to boarding school fairly early anyway. He took his daughters with him round the Suffolk countryside when he was doing business deals. They sat on a cart with him. So they learnt about his entrepreneurial skills and his drive and his energy was passed on to them. So what characterised these women was huge determination, never to accept no for an answer, and to keep on fighting. And that Millicent demonstrates throughout her life. So that's a bit about her background. I should say something about her education. Her mother taught all the children to read and write, on top of running a household for 10 children and a very demanding husband. She wrote his letters for him because she was much more literate and able to do that. She also placated all the people he had rows with. He was extremely domineering and always thought he was right. However, this sort of characteristic, this energy and this certainty was very useful for these daughters who were going to find a new way. And we have to remember what Victorian life, Millicent was born in 1847, was like for most young women. It meant staying at home until you got married. If you didn't get married, you stayed at home and helped your mother. If your family was well off enough, if your family wasn't well off enough, you became a hellish job, a governess. And you ended up as somebody who sat in the background in upper middle class families with no training, taught their children, and the Garrett girls, once they had learned to read and write, had a governess, and Elizabeth, who was the sort of one who was much more forceful than her older sister Louisa, made life hell for this governess because she didn't really know what she was talking about most of the time, and Elizabeth always found out in advance what she should have been talking about, and made it clear that she was not absolutely up to where she should have been on whatever the subject was. They said they didn't want the governess, but both parents insisted they had to have a governess until Newsom, the father, decided the right thing was to send them to boarding school. So they went to a boarding school in Blackheath. Again, very unusual for girls to be sent to school at that period and away from home. This allowed them to develop independence, and they were very, very independent people, and it allowed them to meet young girls and adolescent girls from different parts of the country, make friends, go and stay in different parts of the country, meet other people, and that again was an enormously important part of their development. Let me turn now to what happened when they came home after being at school. They were asked to help in various ways with their mother's organisation and sometimes things that their father might ask them to do. But Elizabeth soon rebelled and said, "This is not what I want to do. This is boring. I want to do something different." And she then decided that what she wanted to do was to be a doctor. But there's another story to be told about Elizabeth, which is a very interesting one as well. I won't go into that now. And the other thing that Elizabeth did was she had Sunday evening discussions with all the children. So they would sit around in the drawing room and she would introduce some area that she thought that they might like to know about. Sometimes it was political, sometimes it was historical, sometimes it was related to the society in which they were living in. So she was a kind of part-time, unpaid teacher to her younger siblings, as well as a role model. And that was, I think, hugely valuable for Millicent, who was known as Millie. Millicent, actually got married very young, rather like the elder sister. She married a man called Henry Fawcett, who was very interesting in and of himself. He was a professor of political economy at Cambridge. He was a Liberal member of Parliament and a radical Liberal. He had very anti-establishment views on all sorts of things. He was even a Republican for a bit, which is very unusual in 19th century Britain. But the little twist of this story is that he had met Elizabeth some time before he met Millicent, and he proposed to Elizabeth. Elizabeth turned him down on the grounds that she couldn't possibly marry until she got herself established in her profession, because it would be a block. Harry didn't give up on the Garrett sisters. 3 or 4 years later, he met Millicent at a dinner party in London, where Millicent was 17 and got up and pronounced on the death of Abraham Lincoln and how this was a great tragedy as a supporter of the northern anti-slavery cause, as Millicent was already by 17. And Harry Fawcett was very taken by this. Not long before he went to Aldborough and asked Millicent's father if he could marry her. But the thing that is most noteworthy about him, he was blind. He was blinded in a hunting accident when his father's shotgun went off by mistake and the pellet went into both eyes. At that time, he was just graduated from Cambridge and was doing some research there. But he was a very, like David Blunkett, who followed him many years later, extraordinarily brave and courageous and always determined that he would never let his blindness get in the way. But I tell all of this because he was a huge influence on Millicent. He was a strong feminist. He believed that she should be able to campaign and do what she liked, and he encouraged her, but he taught her quite a lot, because he brought her into the House of Commons where she could sit observing parliamentary procedure and became familiar with it. So I think we should never deny his supportive role. However, after he became Postmaster General in one of Gladstone's governments, Gladstone rather reluctantly appointed him, I think partly to keep him occupied so he wouldn't be such a nuisance. But he very sadly died young, after they'd been married for 17 years. And she was devastated and felt that she couldn't go on for a bit, but then she realised that Harry would have expected her to return to the campaign, and she decided to go and live with her sister Agnes, who rented 2 Gower Street. So that's how she ended up in 2 Gower Street, and she lived there for the next 45 years with Agnes as her companion. But she had one daughter with Harry called Philippa. Philippa was a rather retiring, shy, perhaps a bit overwhelmed by the powerful personalities of her parents. But she was exceedingly clever, and she went to Cambridge to do a degree in mathematics at Newnham College, which Millicent had helped to found when she lived partly in Cambridge when Harry was a professor there, and partly in London when he had to be in London for his parliamentary work. And Philippa was awarded a sort of special prize, in a sense, in that she was above the senior wrangler in the mathematics tripos. She couldn't be the senior wrangler because only a man could be the senior wrangler. But she was hugely praised and lauded for that achievement. And she went on to become a fellow of Newnham, and for a little while was an academic. Although she ended up not doing the sort of thing that her mother would have liked her to have done, which would have been something very, very spectacular up there in the public realm. She was too reticent and retiring for that. But she went to the LCC and became a senior administrator, which Ruth G and I were involved with together many years ago. So that's sort of another link I feel I have with the Garrett Fawcett family. She was the only woman in a senior management job, and she stayed there for the rest of her life and died in 1948. So that is her family. Let me now tell you a little bit about some of the other things she did outside the campaign for Votes for Women. First of all, as I've already, I think, intimated, she was very, very concerned about the lack of opportunities for women to go to university and get any higher education. And she fought in Cambridge for, first of all, for women to be able to, before Newnham was established, before Girton was established, when she was very young, she was in her very early 20s, that women should be able to register and attend lectures, even though there was absolutely no chance of them taking exams and getting a degree. Once that opportunity for them to actually follow a degree course happened, they still, as most of you will know, were not able to get a degree at the end. They could not be called BA Cantab. That didn't come until, wait for it, the 1940s. And Millicent was involved in later campaigns to try to change this and was utterly despairing when the male fraternity in senior positions in Cambridge wouldn't allow women to have a formal qualification from their studies in Cambridge. So that was another of her campaigns, and she also was concerned to see more opportunities for girls to get secondary education. Elizabeth actually became a member of the London School Board, to which she was elected, and another of the sisters who I haven't yet mentioned, Alice, also became a member of the London School Board. Alice married a rather boring lawyer and went to live in Calcutta with him, so she was a Raj wife for quite a long time. But she spent huge amounts of time working on her husband's books. Her husband wrote a 1,000-page book about cases in Indian law, and she did a lot of the editing and research, but of course, as was happened in that time, no acknowledgement really for that. But she was a woman who could have, had she stayed in the UK, probably had a career like her sisters, or been involved in some campaign. She was very good at figures, so she was allowed, when she left school, to work in her father's counting house for 6 hours a day, which was better probably than simply doing the organisation of the housework. It gave her a kind of go in life to do that well. Coming back to her other campaigns, she believed very passionately in equality between men and women in a sexual sphere in terms of marriage. She campaigned for women to be treated equally in the case of divorce, which was certainly not the case, as many of you will know, and to have equal access to children in the case of divorce. She was a bit prudish in some ways. She buttoned up. It's very hard to understand what her real attitude was to sex, other than that sex outside marriage was completely unacceptable to her. She campaigned against a man called Henry Cust, who was a Conservative politician. When he tried to get a seat in Liverpool, she said he was unsuitable because he was a serial philanderer. He got some upper middle class woman pregnant, and a forced marriage took place. The child was then born preterally and died of a miserable marriage. This man also, I think is the grandfather or great-grandfather of Margaret Thatcher, because he had a relationship with a maid in some country house, And that maid, or the maid's child, was one of Thatcher's ancestors. He's never talked about, but it's true. So that side of her I find less attractive. She was not tolerant in any way when it came to sexual relationships. But she also was very good in campaigning against the white slave trade, as it was called in those days. So she sometimes set people up to go down to the ports where girls who would arrive, either from outside London or from abroad, and be picked up by people who were basically procuring them for prostitution. And at one point she set up a group of people to go and point out to a quite well-known man that he'd been discovered, and to say that unless he refrained from this kind of behaviour, she would publicise it. So that was another of her campaigns. She campaigned against early marriage and believed that it was entirely wrong that girls could still get married at 13 in her young life, when she was in her 20s and 30s. In fact, it very rarely happened in the UK, but the law needed to be changed, and she pressurised for that. She was also interested in India. Her husband was sometimes known as the MP for India because he did a lot of work on trying to ensure that our colonial role in India should be rather more acceptable than it was in many respects, and that Indian taxpayers should not be asked to pay for campaigns that we were having in a country like Egypt. So she, although she never went to India, she was concerned about opportunities for girls in India, and certainly opposed to very early marriage there. And later on, when there was a reasonably progressive Secretary of State for India, Edwin Montagu, on a number of occasions she went and lobbied him about that kind of thing. So this is, I'm just trying to give you some understanding of the range of things that concerned her. She also was absolutely committed to the idea that women should be able to work on the same basis as men. So she took a really rather odd position on the Factory Acts. She was opposed to limiting the hours that women would work on the grounds that if you did that, it would be less likely that they would get a job, or if they got a job, their earnings would be reduced because the hours they were working were fewer. She didn't have much imagination, I think, about what it would be like to be a working class woman with several children, having to look after her children and her home and work for maybe 12 hours a day in the factory. She didn't quite get it. Later on, towards the end of her life, she changed her position on this, but I would say she was not progressive about it because she didn't really understand. The other area where she, I think, was hugely mistaken was when compulsory education was introduced in 1880. She thought that parents should be charged, they should pay a fee, and only if they paid a fee would they really appreciate the importance of education. So that was a very, I think, distorted view, and again shows that she didn't really understand enough about how hard it would be for a lot of working class people to pay fees for their children to go to school. So I've given you the negatives as well as the positives. There's one other negative I need to talk about. She was a liberal imperialist. She was very patriotic. She thought that Britain was by far the best place in the world to live in many, many respects. And she was totally against Irish independence. She campaigned against Home Rule. She was a liberal unionist, and when the Liberal Party split, she took the unionist side. Eventually, she abandoned all parties, by the way, because she thought she had been terribly, terribly tricked and outmaneuvered by both Gladstone and Asquith, who were, of course, Liberal Prime Ministers. And she once said, I've had enough of the games that Liberal leaders play. I no longer want to be part of it. So she also didn't actually think that party organisation should be part of the campaign for votes for women, because in all parties there will be some people who were passionately in favour of it, but in all parties there would be some people who were against. So the thing was to take Conservatives who were on the whole against it, but if they were in favour, then they should be allowed to be involved. But she didn't want a sort of party approach to it. She believed it should be done on the basis of a campaign to which you adhered, regardless of what your politics were. Her liberal imperialism meant that she was in favour of the Boer War, where many progressives were not at that time. She thought that the iu3a should be allowed to play a role, and that the Boers had, under Paul Kruger, had not given them their rights. And so it's complicated, but again, it's a longer story. But as a result of her position in the Boer War, when the concentration camps which the British set up and locked up women and children who lived on Boer farms, on the grounds that they were protecting them, which is a pretty feeble argument. They were actually wanting to stop them providing bases for Boer soldiers in the countryside. And these places had very high death rates, where children died of things like measles, and it became a scandal. And so the British government had to set up an inquiry, and they sent her as the chairman of it. It was the first time that a woman had been given a role of this sort. And to be fair to her, she was rigorous in how she went about it. They went to a lot of different camps. They took evidence from large numbers of people, and they were critical of some aspects. But they thought that good education was being provided on the whole for these children, and that they might have been better off in these camps than at home. Highly questionable. It wasn't quite a whitewash, but it wasn't perhaps the sort of progressive report we might have expected from her. So I'll now move on before I leave you to ask me some questions about votes for women. She always thought that being concerned with women and their needs and their rights was a noble cause, which of course it was, especially in those days when you looked at the extraordinary things that would be said about why women couldn't vote. They couldn't vote because it would take them away from looking after their children and their homes. It would distract them. They couldn't vote because they didn't have enough intelligence and understanding of the political world to do so. There are a whole lot of arguments of this sort, which she always was clever at demolishing. She was an intellectual woman in many ways. She read widely, she wrote a lot. She wrote about 7 different books of varying quality. And again, we can talk about that afterwards, but I won't now. But she, very early in her marriage, made it clear that this is what she wanted to give as her prime role. These other things that I talked about were important, but votes for women was the thing that she was most focused on. And she was very influenced by John Stuart Mill and his book on the subjection of women. She had a signed copy of it, which was something she treasured all her life. She met him through her husband, who was a kind of Mill disciple in many ways, and he was a hero for her. His own views about her were a bit mixed. He thought she was a bit sort of prosaic and not perhaps as I think, what word should I use? Not inspiring enough. However, I think that was quite a hard judgment, and I think he withdrew from it later, because she did inspire a huge number of women to take part in the campaign for votes for women. What was that campaign? Initially, it was set up as a relatively small-scale movement, starting in London, but then spreading to a number of the big cities around the country. And she went on many regional tours, and these regional tours amounted to her giving speaking, taking part in speaking events. Sometimes they were in the drawing rooms of upper middle class women. Sometimes they were in a bigger hall. But they were all committed to the notion that it is the right of every woman to be able to take part in an election and be properly represented as far as Parliament was concerned. And this movement required more and more people being concerned with it, but it was too much on a small scale. It didn't really engage and bring in the masses. A lot of her work was also trying to influence parliamentarians. So she took part in lobbies, she wrote hundreds of letters to newspapers, she produced pamphlets. The movement had a magazine called The Common Cause. And slowly she became the person who most people recognised as its leader. But that really didn't happen until towards the end of the 19th century. There had been two reform bills where they had tried to change the bills, which were about trying to give more men the right to vote, rural men who didn't have the same kind of access to voting as men who lived in urban areas. They tried to include women in these reform acts. There was one in 1868 and then another one in 1887, I think it was. None of these attempts to amend them worked. They didn't get through. The movement became split on various things, on whether to include all women or whether to focus on married women or women over 30 or women with property. And Millicent always took the slightly more cautious view. You know, she was sort of Fabian in a way, start small and grow. And so she didn't want to try to do everything all in one go, because she said, we'll never succeed that way. We'll have to chip away, and so that's what she did. From the beginnings of the 20th century, the movement grew, became the NWUSS, the NUWSSS, the National Union for Women's Suffrage Societies, and there were more and more of them over the country. But still, they weren't really managing to shift the politicians. There were always a good number of politicians, particularly in the Liberal Party, and then when the Labour Party got a number of seats in the 1906 election, they were all 100% for women's suffrage. It wasn't enough to win through. So some people started to get a bit impatient with this. And they were led by Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters. So they split off and formed a separate group. And at first, Millicent thought this was fine. There was plenty of room for them, as well as for us. And you know, she was very sympathetic when women were arrested and sent to prison, and of course force-fed, and she even organised, wait for it, at the Savoy, a special party for women who had been released from prison. And she argued that there is far more violence being directed at women by the government and the police and the establishment than they ever committed. Once that changed, and Emmeline and Christabel in particular decided to up the ante and start breaking windows, putting lighted papers into post boxes, committing arson, blowing up railway stations. They never did it when there were going to be people involved, but it was very destructive. That Millicent drew the line at. She argued, no, this is not going to win the battle. It is going to alienate as many people as it attracts. And I think she was actually right about that, because the politicians started saying, we won't change while this violence goes on, because they didn't want to be seen to have given up to what they saw as a regular, illegal, violent acts. So this departure meant there was a split. However, in 1914, when the First World War broke out, both Emmeline and Millicent, quite separately, decided they should stop campaigning. They should put everything into supporting the campaign to win the war, and they saw it as their public responsibility not to distract from that. So Emmeline, in fact, was as much of a patriot as was Millicent. This is a way in which they were similar. They were similar in much other ways, which we'll talk about if we have time. So during the course of the war, they spent much more time, both of them, but particularly Millicent, campaigning to get women who were being employed in larger and larger numbers in jobs which they would never have done before, because so many men were sent to the trenches, and to get equal pay for them. She'd moved towards arguing that there's no reason why they should be paid less than men doing the same job. And she was, considered to be responsible and correct in her support for women in jobs, from being bus drivers to being accountants, being treated properly. Through that later period of the war, she started campaigning again, not in terms of great big marches. I didn't tell you about the marches that went from the Embankment to Hyde Park, and then she'd stand on a cart and speak. There was a lot of that kind of campaigning in the period from about 1906 through until the start of the war. She then started trying to get to the politicians again. So she demanded meetings with Asquith. Asquith became her hate figure. Asquith was always either opposed to votes for women or indifferent. And he always argued, well, I see no cause for making this change because there's no demand for it. So she would say, but Mr. Asquith, let me tell you what's happened in Yorkshire last week, or what happened in Somerset the week before, when so many people went out and marched and so on. But he was immovable, and he'd also, in many ways, he was also dishonest, because he fobbed her off. And so, having had an earlier Liberal Prime Minister, Gladstone, as a hate figure, Asquith became an even bigger one. She also went to see Lloyd George, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he was marginally better, but he wasn't really prepared to do the work required to persuade his boss, the Prime Minister, that they had to do something different. But once Asquith went at the end of 1916, and Lloyd George became the Prime Minister, there was more hope. And in 1917, he agreed that they should put a bill through Parliament, a reform bill, which would allow at least some women to vote. That happened, and in 1918, women over 30, the original proposal had been 35, and Millicent and ours got it brought down to 30, and who were either householders or married to householders. They had to have some property. That went through, and there were huge celebrations, wonderful events took place in the Albert Hall and so on. And by 1920, Millicent decided it was time for others to take over, younger people. So she stopped being the president of the NUWSS, and she took to campaigning internationally. There were some countries that had been ahead of us, and I'll tell you about which they were after if you like, and others that were around the same time at the end of the First World War, and others much later. The French did not have votes for women till the end of the Second World War, and the Swiss, of course, didn't until 1971. So she spent time continuing to push for moving towards universal suffrage during the 1920s, but she wasn't the leader of this campaign. And in 1928, under a Conservative government led by Balfour, women were given universal suffrage, which she lived to see. She died in 1929. I want to end just with a quote from her about what she said to young people who were continuing to be part of the campaign for greater equality for women. So if you just let me find the right place in my book. What she said was, "It's very splendid to see you taking up your responsibilities and carrying on our work into the new fields where it must now be pursued. I look upon the formation of your council and its achievements with the greatest pride, and I feel that the future of the movement will be safe and triumphant in your hands. I believe, of course, that it will change and develop. You will probably find new methods and new needs, and your ways will be full systems instead of the way of beggars and outcasts as ours for so long had to be. But I feel confident that you will find, as we did, that the cause of real freedom of women is a great one, worth one's best service, and that you will never lose sight of it, even amidst your new opportunities. It is not the only good cause in the world, nor the only one you will care for, but it does lie with you to care for it. And for all its changes, it is the same that we older women cared for. And it does lie close to our hands as women, and it must not be forgotten until it is wholly achieved. You know from your own experience that equal pay and equal economic opportunity are still withheld from us. I shall expect to see you individually and collectively putting your shoulders to that wheel and pushing the car of progress along in your generation as we try to do in ours. And I know you find that in this struggle there is enjoyment, pleasure, and real interest as long as you believe in your cause and in your associates.